The dust swirled with a malevolent energy, coating everything in a gritty film of ochre and despair. It settled on the raw timber of the platform, on the sparse, sun-scorched grass that clung precariously to life beside the tracks, and on the woman who stood alone, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. Her bonnet, once perhaps a hopeful blue, was now faded and stained, shadowing a face pale with an exhaustion that went deeper than mere travel. Her hands, raw and chapped, clutched a worn carpet bag as if it were the last anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Each gust of wind seemed to buffet her slight frame, threatening to carry her away like a dry leaf. She scanned the desolate horizon, her gaze flickering with a desperate hope that dwindled with every passing moment, every empty vista. The train, a monstrous, soot-belching harbinger of her arrival, had long since hissed and clanked its way into the shimmering distance, leaving behind an oppressive silence broken only by the keening wind and the frantic thumping of her own heart. She had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, the promise of a new life curdling into a familiar, sickening dread. Food had been scarce on the long journey west, sleep even scarcer, her nights haunted by spectres she thought she'd outrun. Now, the sun beat down with merciless intensity, the heat rising in waves from the parched earth, and the last of her reserves began to fail. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the dusty scene before her eyes tilting and blurring. She swayed, her grip on the bag faltering. Jedediah Stone watched from the meager shade of the station agent's lean-to. He'd seen the train arrive, seen her disembark, the only passenger for Redemption Creek. He'd been expecting someone. A woman. The letter had been brief, practical, like the advertisement he'd reluctantly placed. He was a man of few words and fewer comforts, his ranch clinging to existence by the sheer force of his will. He needed help, a partner, though the word felt foreign and presumptuous on his tongue. He hadn't expected this wraith, this whisper of a woman who looked as if she might shatter if he spoke too loudly. He'd given her time, watched her expectant stance slowly crumble into something akin to desolation. He was not a man given to impulse, but a cold knot of something unfamiliar tightened in his chest as he saw her knees buckle. He started forward, his long strides eating up the distance, just as she crumpled, a small, discarded heap on the unforgiving planks. The station agent, a portly man named Silas, waddled out, peering down at her with more annoyance than concern. "Well, now. Ain't that just typical? Another one bites the dust, eh, Stone? What'd you expect, ordering one sight unseen?" Jed ignored him, kneeling beside the unconscious woman. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow. Her face, even in its pallor, held a fineness, a delicacy that seemed out of place in this raw land. He lifted a hand, calloused and weathered, and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. It was damp with sweat. This was not what he'd planned. But the sight of her, so utterly vulnerable, stirred a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. Silas grumbled, "Best just leave her be. She'll come round. Or she won't." "Ain't my concern." Jed's gaze, when he lifted it to Silas, was flat and cold. "She's my concern." He looked back at the woman. Leaving her here was unthinkable. Taking her to his ranch, unmarried, unchaperoned, the scandal would follow them both, tarnish her further. There was a circuit preacher, Reverend Albright, due in town, staying at the only boarding house, waiting for the evening stage. A sudden, stark resolve hardened Jed's expression. He rose. "Silas. Fetch Reverend Albright. Tell him there's a wedding." Silas's jaw dropped. "A wedding? She's half dead." Jed's voice was quiet but unyielding. "She's my intended. She took ill on the journey. We'll have the ceremony now." He didn't wait for an argument, didn't offer further explanation. He bent and carefully, surprisingly gently, lifted the unconscious woman into his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her carpet bag falling with a soft thud. He picked it up too, his mind already moving past the shock of his own decision, focusing on the immediate, the necessary. He would protect this stranger. He would give her his name, a shield against the harshness of this world, even if she never knew to ask for it. The journey to the ranch was a slow, jolting affair. Jed had laid her on a bed of burlap sacks in the back of the buckboard, cushioning her head with his own rolled-up coat. The sun climbed higher, beating down with an unforgiving glare, and the air grew thick with dust kicked up by the horses' hooves and the wagon's unsteady wheels. He drove with a practiced hand, navigating the ruts and rocks of the barely discernible track that led to his isolated holding. Each lurch of the wagon sent a pang of concern through him, but she remained lost to the world, her face turned towards the rough planking, a fragile stillness about her. He glanced back frequently, his expression unreadable. The preacher, a nervous man with sweat stains blooming on his black coat, had performed the ceremony with hurried solemnity right there on the station platform, Silas and a bewildered-looking telegraph operator serving as reluctant witnesses. Jed had spoken the vows in a low, steady voice, his gaze fixed on the unconscious woman in his arms. When it came time for her responses, the preacher had simply nodded, accepting Jed's terse assertion that her prior agreement stood. No name had been asked for, none given on her behalf. She was simply this woman, joined to him in a bizarre, silent contract. The land they traversed was a testament to struggle, parched earth, skeletal trees, distant, saw-toothed mountains that offered no comfort, only a stark reminder of their insignificance. His ranch, when it finally came into view, was little more than a cabin, a small barn, and a series of corrals, all weathered to a uniform silver grey, huddled against the vast emptiness. It was a place of solitude, of relentless work, and, until now, of profound loneliness, though he would never have admitted it. He carried her inside the cabin. It was small, just 2 rooms, but clean, scrubbed bare by his own hands. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs its main furnishings. A narrow bedstead stood in one corner, his own. He laid her there gently, pulling a threadbare quilt over her. For a long moment, he stood looking down at her, a stranger who was now his wife. Her breathing was a little deeper now, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. He touched her forehead again, the clamminess was gone. He turned and went outside, the immensity of what he'd done settling upon him not as a weight, but as a new, unbidden responsibility. He began the evening chores, the familiar rhythm a small comfort in the face of the profound uncertainty that had just entered his life. Later, as twilight bled across the sky, casting long shadows, he checked on her again. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with confusion, then widened with a dawning fear as they focused on him, a large, unfamiliar man standing in the dim light of the cabin. She tried to sit up, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. "Easy now," Jed said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe." He poured a dipper of water from the bucket by the door and held it out. "Water?" She stared at the dipper, then at him, her gaze searching, wary. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand. The first days passed in a haze of weakness and watchful silence for the woman who now lay in Jedediah Stone's bed. She slept mostly, a deep, exhausted sleep that seemed to be slowly mending the frayed edges of her body and spirit. When awake, she lay still, her eyes following Jed's movements as he came and went, tending to her with a surprising gentleness that sat oddly with his rugged appearance. He brought her water, thin broth, and once, a piece of bread with a smear of precious molasses. He never pressed her to eat, simply left the offerings by the bedside. His presence was a constant, quiet thrum in the small cabin. He moved with an economy of motion, his tasks performed with a practiced efficiency that spoke of long habit. She saw him mend harnesses in the dim light of the evening, his large hands surprisingly deft. She heard him before dawn, the creak of the floorboards, the quiet sounds of him stoking the fire, then the rhythmic clang of the pump handle outside as he drew water. The cabin itself was stark, almost monastic. Every object had its purpose, nothing was superfluous. The walls were bare logs, chinked with mud and straw. A few cast iron pots hung by the hearth. A single shelf held a handful of chipped plates and tin cups. It was a place of hardship, yet there was an order to it, a cleanliness that spoke of self-respect. She observed him, cataloguing the details. The way his brow furrowed in concentration when he worked, the slight limp in his left leg, more pronounced when he was tired. The lines etched around his eyes, telling of sun and worry. He was not a handsome man in the conventional sense, his features too angular, too weathered, but there was a strength in his face, a deep-seated resilience that she found herself clinging to, even as fear remained a cold knot in her stomach. He asked nothing of her. No questions about her past, her journey, not even her name. His silence was a vast, empty space, and she didn't know whether to be grateful for it or terrified by it. Her own silence was a shield, born of habit and a deep, ingrained caution. Words had so often been weapons used against her. After a few days, a little strength returned. She managed to sit up, propped against the wall, the quilt drawn up to her chin. She found a small, neatly folded pile of her own meager belongings from the carpet bag placed on a crate beside the bed. Among them, a slightly torn chemise. Her fingers, still clumsy, picked at a loose thread. Later, when Jed was outside, she painstakingly mended the tear with a needle and thread she found tucked into a corner of her bag. It was a small act, but it felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of herself. One afternoon, as he sat at the table sharpening a knife, his movements methodical and precise, their eyes met. His were a startling grey, clear and direct. There was no judgment in them, no demand, only a quiet observation that mirrored her own. The moment stretched, unspoken questions hanging in the air, before he looked back down at his work. She felt a flicker, not of fear, but of something else, something she couldn't name. A fragile awareness. That night, fragments of her past, the reasons for her desperate flight, clawed at the edges of her sleep, shouting voices, the scent of stale beer and cheap perfume, a man's heavy hand. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the oppressive darkness of the cabin amplifying her terror. A week into her silent convalescence, the woman, still unnamed between them, woke to find a single, defiant prairie bloom, a splash of improbable lavender, in a tin cup beside her water. Jedediah was nowhere in sight, already out on the ranch, but the flower spoke in his absence, a quiet offering that bypassed the need for words. She touched a delicate petal, a ghost of a smile gracing her lips for the first time since, she couldn't remember when. Later that day, when he came in for his noon meal, a hunk of dry bread and some jerky, which he ate standing by the door, as if reluctant to fully enter her temporary domain, she found her voice. It was a mere whisper, rusty from disuse. "Thank you," she said, her gaze on the flower. Jed stopped chewing. He looked at the cup, then at her. A slight, almost imperceptible nod was his only response, but his eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer than usual. The word, small as it was, seemed to shift something in the cabin's atmosphere, a subtle crack in the wall of silence that had separated them. That evening, he didn't eat by the door. He pulled out the second chair, the one that had remained vacant, and sat at the table. He placed a plate with a portion of his own meager stew before her, then one for himself. They ate in silence, but it was a different silence now, less strained, imbued with a tentative awareness. The clink of their spoons against the tin plates was the only sound, save for the sigh of the wind outside, a constant mournful companion in this isolated world. The next day, she felt strong enough to leave the bed for more than a few minutes. She moved slowly, tentatively, her legs still unsteady. While Jed was out checking a distant fence line, she found a broom fashioned from bound twigs and swept the cabin floor. It was a small contribution, but the simple act of doing, of creating order, was a balm to her frayed nerves. She folded the quilt on the bed neatly, smoothed the burlap sacks. When Jed returned, he stopped in the doorway, his gaze sweeping the cabin. He said nothing, but she saw the slight lift of an eyebrow, the way his eyes rested for a moment on the tidied space. He didn't acknowledge it directly, but that evening, he left a bucket of freshly pumped water inside the door, instead of his usual practice of leaving it out on the porch, a silent concession to her presence within the home. The prairie wind picked up that night, howling around the small cabin like a hungry wolf, rattling the single window pane in its frame. The temperature dropped, and the fire in the hearth, though Jed fed it diligently, seemed to offer little defense against the encroaching cold. She shivered under the thin quilt, listening to the wind's desolate cry, a sound that echoed the emptiness she often felt inside. Yet, in the flickering firelight, watching Jed's solid, reassuring presence as he sat mending a bridle, a tiny, fragile seed of security began to take root. He was a constant, a bulwark against the storm, both outside and, perhaps, within. The weeks bled into a month. The woman, Eliza, though Jed did not yet know her name, nor she his beyond that Mr. Estone the preacher had used, moved about the small cabin now with a quiet purpose. She had taken over the cooking, such as it was, transforming their meager supplies into something a little more palatable than Jed's bachelor fare. She mended his worn shirts, patched the knees of his denims, her stitches small and neat. He accepted her ministrations without comment, but she noticed he no longer left his torn clothing in a heap, but placed it on the small crate by her former sickbed, an unspoken request. One afternoon, while she was kneading dough for a batch of biscuits, a rare treat made with a precious bit of flour Jed had brought back from a supply run to a distant, dusty settlement, she saw him standing by the window, not looking out, but staring at a small, faded tintype he held in his calloused hand. His back was to her, but the set of his shoulders, the way his head was bowed, spoke of a profound, solitary grief. He didn't know she was watching. After a long moment, he carefully tucked the photograph into his shirt pocket, the gesture almost reverent, and his face, when he eventually turned, was as stoic and unreadable as ever. But Eliza had seen. She understood, in that instant, that his silence, his isolation, was not just a matter of temperament, but of a sorrow deeply buried. That night, the spectres of her own past returned with a vengeance. She woke with a stifled scream, sitting bolt upright in the narrow cot Jed had fashioned for her in the cabin's other small room, a space previously used for storage. The dream had been vivid, a dimly lit room, the leering face of a man whose name she had tried so hard to forget, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. She was trembling, cold sweat clinging to her skin. The floorboards in the main room creaked. Jed appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the dying embers in the hearth. He said nothing, merely stood there, his presence a silent question. A bad dream, she managed, her voice shaky. He nodded slowly. He didn't pry, didn't offer platitudes. He simply remained for a few moments, a steady, grounding presence in the terrifying darkness, until her breathing evened and the frantic pounding of her heart began to subside. Then, as silently as he had come, he retreated. His restraint was a kindness she was unaccustomed to. The next morning, the unspoken understanding between them seemed to deepen. When Jed came in from his morning chores, he found a pot of something vaguely resembling coffee brewing on the hearth, chicory, mostly, but hot and dark. He paused, then poured himself a cup, his eyes meeting hers over the rim. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. They still hadn't exchanged names, the fundamental currency of identity. It was a strange, suspended existence, two solitary souls orbiting each other in the vastness of the plains, bound by a bizarre ceremony and the unspoken burdens of their pasts. The ranch itself demanded relentless effort, and slowly, she began to assist in small ways beyond the cabin. She learned to feed the few scrawny chickens, to weed the pathetic patch of garden Jed had attempted to cultivate near the well. He never asked, but when she took on a task, he didn't stop her. A fragile rhythm was establishing itself, a life built on shared labor and unspoken reliance. One cool evening, as a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, Eliza sat by the dying fire, darning one of Jed's socks. He was at the table, meticulously cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes soft sounds in the otherwise quiet cabin. The silence stretched, comfortable now, almost companionable. She finished her mending, folded the sock, and then, on an impulse she couldn't quite explain, she took a charred stick from the hearth and smoothed a patch of dirt on the floor. Slowly, carefully, she wrote a single word, Eliza. She looked up at him. He had stopped his work, his grey eyes fixed on the letters in the dust. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he picked up the charred stick she had laid down, and beside her name, he wrote, Jed. He didn't add that Edia. Just Jed. He looked at her, a faint inclination of his head. Eliza. Jed. The names hung in the air, simple, fundamental, yet their utterance, even in this silent script, felt like a seismic shift. It was an acknowledgement, a bridge built across the chasm of their anonymity. A small smile touched Eliza's lips, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. He didn't smile back, but the harsh lines around his mouth seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. The next day, a minor crisis erupted. A section of fence bordering the meager pasture where Jed kept his few cattle had collapsed overnight, likely due to a burrowing animal. If the cattle strayed onto the open range, they could be lost for good, a devastating blow to his already struggling enterprise. Jed discovered it at dawn, his face grim. Eliza, seeing his haste and the set of his jaw, knew something was wrong. Without a word, she pulled on her sturdiest shoes and followed him out. He didn't send her back. For hours, they worked under the increasingly hot sun. Jed dug new post holes with furious energy, his shirt soaked with sweat, the muscles in his arms and back straining. Eliza, despite her lack of experience, proved surprisingly resourceful. She dragged fallen timbers, handed him tools, her movements becoming more confident as she anticipated his needs. At one point, he stumbled, a wave of exhaustion hitting him as he tried to lift a particularly heavy post into place. He swore under his breath, a rare display of frustration. Eliza was there instantly, her shoulder braced against the wood, adding her slight strength to his. Together, they maneuvered it into the hole. He grunted, a sound that might have been thanks, then straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at her then, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even grudging respect, in his tired eyes. The shared labor, the unspoken teamwork, forged a new link between them, stronger than any words. By midday, the fence was mended. They walked back to the cabin side by side, weary but with a sense of shared accomplishment. The vast, empty land around them seemed, for a moment, a little less hostile. The fragile piece of their established routine was shattered not by a person, but by the sky itself. Dark, bruised clouds began to gather on the western horizon late one afternoon, massing with an ominous speed. The wind, usually a constant sigh, picked up, whipping Eliza's skirts around her legs as she hurried to bring in the chickens. Jed stood by the barn, his gaze fixed on the approaching storm, his face grim. "Blizzard," he said, the word stark and flat. A bad one, by the looks of it. There was no time to prepare in any meaningful way beyond the immediate. He checked the latches on the barn door, secured the lean-to where he kept his meager supply of firewood. Eliza rushed to fill every available container with water from the pump, her heart thudding with a familiar dread. She had known hardship, but the raw, untamed fury of nature on these plains was a different kind of threat. The first flakes began to fall as dusk descended, soft and almost benign at first, then rapidly intensifying, driven by a howling wind that shrieked like a banshee around the corners of the cabin. Visibility dropped to near zero. The world outside their small dwelling was erased, replaced by a maelstrom of swirling white. Inside, Jed worked with grim efficiency, stuffing rags into the cracks around the window and door, reinforcing the bar on the door. The temperature plummeted. Eliza kept the fire blazing, feeding it precious logs, the only source of warmth and light against the storm's onslaught. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her, but watching Jed's calm, methodical actions was a steadying influence. He moved like a man who had faced such battles before and, if not triumphed, had at least endured. For 2 days and nights, the blizzard raged. The wind never ceased its deafening roar, and the snow piled high against the cabin walls, sealing them into a small, isolated world. They spoke little, the noise outside making conversation difficult. Jed rationed their firewood, their food. He slept by the door, a heavy axe within reach, though against what, Eliza wasn't sure. Perhaps it was just habit, the instinct of a man long accustomed to being solely responsible for his own survival. During a brief lull on the second day, Jed fought his way to the barn to check on his horse and the milk cow. He returned coated in snow, his face raw from the wind, but reported the animals were safe, though restless. Eliza had hot chicory coffee ready for him, and a piece of warmed bread. He took it with a nod, his eyes expressing a gratitude his words did not. The shared confinement, the common enemy of the storm, stripped away another layer of their reserve. They were two souls huddled together against the elemental fury of the world, their survival intertwined. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, the silence was almost as shocking as the previous din. The world outside was transformed, a vast, undulating expanse of blinding white, beautiful and deadly. The cabin was half buried. Jed dug them out, the labor immense, the snow packed hard and deep. When he finally cleared a path to the door, the sunlight reflecting off the snow was dazzling. They stood together in the doorway, blinking against the brightness, surveying the new, silent landscape. The immediate threat had passed, but the aftermath would bring its own challenges. Wood was scarce, game would be harder to find. But they had weathered it. Together. The shared ordeal of the blizzard left an indelible mark on the fragile connection between Jed and Eliza. The walls of the cabin, which had enclosed them during the storm, seemed to retain a residue of that enforced intimacy. In the days that followed, as they dug out from under the immense snowfall and began the arduous task of assessing the damage and securing their immediate future, a new level of understanding began to bloom in the silences between them. The hardship was undeniable, the small garden was buried, likely lost until spring, and the paths to the well and the barn were treacherous tunnels through the deep drifts. Jed spent long hours hunting, returning with meager game, a rabbit, a few prairie birds, his face etched with fatigue and the strain of providing. Eliza stretched these small provisions with a skill born of necessity, making stews that warned them against the lingering chill, baking bread that, while coarse, filled their bellies. One evening, as she was mending a tear in his heavy coat, the needle moving rhythmically in the dim light of a precious tallow candle, she spoke, her voice soft. "You've known storms like this before." It wasn't a question, but a statement. Jed, who was oiling a trap by the hearth, paused. He looked into the fire for a long moment before answering, his voice low. "A few." None quite this early in the season. He didn't elaborate, but the admission, small as it was, felt significant. Later that week, driven by a need she couldn't quite articulate, Eliza decided to share a piece of her own story. They were seated at the table, a rare moment of respite after a grueling day. "I left a place called Lowriesville," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on her tightly clasped hands. "My stepfather, he wasn't a kind man. After my mother passed, things became difficult," she faltered, the words catching in her throat. The memories were a bitter tide, threatening to overwhelm her. Jed listened, his expression unchanging, but his usual restless energy was stilled. He didn't prompt her, didn't rush her. He simply waited, offering her the space to speak, or not speak, as she chose. She couldn't bring herself to say more, not yet. The shame and fear were still too raw. But she had opened a door, just a crack, into the locked room of her past. Jed nodded slowly when her voice trailed off. "Some men ain't fit to be called such," he said, his tone flat, but with an undercurrent of something that sounded like understanding. He didn't press for details. Later, he spoke of his own land, not of people or past griefs directly, but of the relentless struggle against the elements, the failed crops, the winters that took their toll on livestock and spirit. "This ranch," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the dark window, "it belonged to my father. And he's before him. They broke their backs on it. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just breaking a mind for nothing." That wasn't a complaint, more a weary observation, a crack in his own stoic facade. In that shared vulnerability, however brief, they found a deeper resonance. The harshness of their lives was a common ground, a crucible forging a bond stronger than any formal vow spoken over an unconscious bride. Spring arrived slowly, hesitantly, like a shy visitor. The vast expanses of snow reluctantly gave way to muddy, then greening, plains. The creek, which had been a frozen trickle, began to flow with a robust murmur, a sound of life returning. With the thaw came a renewed sense of possibility, but also a stark awareness of their precarious situation. Supplies were dangerously low. Jed grew quieter, the lines of worry deepening around his eyes. He knew he would have to make a trip to the settlement, a journey of several days, to trade what few furs he had managed to trap for essential provisions. The thought of leaving Eliza alone for that long gnawed at him, an unfamiliar concern. He broached the subject one evening, the words awkward and unaccustomed. "I'll need to go to Redemption Creek. For flour, salt." Soon Eliza looked up from the shirt she was mending. "I understand." He hesitated, then continued, "It's a long ride. For maybe 5 days, if the weather holds." He didn't say what he was truly thinking, that the ranch was isolated, that she would be alone, vulnerable. That perhaps, this was her chance. "When I get back," he said, his gaze not quite meeting hers, "if you've a mind to, there's a stage that passes through Redemption Creek. Heads east. I could see you had passage. The offer hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. He was giving her an out. A chance to leave this harsh life, this marriage of necessity, this silent, stoic man. To return to whatever world she had known, or to find a new one, free of him. Eliza's needle stilled. Her heart gave a painful lurch. Leave? The thought was a sudden, sharp pang. She looked around the small, rustic cabin. It was no palace, her life here no gentle idyll. It was hard, unyielding. Yet, she thought of the quiet companionship, the shared labor, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. She thought of the single prairie bloom, the way he'd stood as a bulwark against her nightmares, the shared exhaustion after mending the fence. Here, for the first time in a long time, she had felt safe. Not entirely, perhaps not from the world, but from the immediate, personal cruelties she had known. Here, she had found a measure of peace, a sense of purpose. She looked at Jed. His face was impassive, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. He was offering her freedom, perhaps at a cost to himself he wouldn't admit. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but firm. There's work to be done here, Jed. The garden needs planting, if we're to have anything for next winter. He looked up, his grey eyes searching hers. Are you certain, Eliza? I'm certain, she replied, a small, steady resolve settling within her. This is my home now. The long silence filled the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Jed's gaze remained on her, and slowly, very slowly, the harsh lines around his mouth softened. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't say thank you, didn't speak of relief or any other emotion. But as he looked away, towards the flickering flames, Eliza thought she saw a different light in his eyes, a lessening of the solitary burden he always seemed to carry. The choice had been made. She would stay. The decision to stay, spoken aloud, settled over the small cabin like a benediction. A subtle shift occurred in their interactions, an easing of the unspoken tensions. Jed didn't go to Redemption Creek immediately. He postponed the trip, citing the need to get the spring planting done first. Together, they tilled the small patch of land near the well, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Eliza, though unused to such heavy labor, worked with a determined spirit, her hands growing calloused, her face touched by the sun. Jed watched her, a quiet approval in his eyes. He taught her how to identify edible wild greens, how to set simple snares for rabbits. She, in turn, showed him how to make a more flavorful stew with the tough game he brought back, how to mend his clothes so they lasted longer. They were building a life, piece by piece, out of the raw materials of the harsh land and their own resilience. The cabin, once just a shelter, began to feel more like a home. Eliza found a patch of hardy wildflowers and transplanted them near the doorway, their bright colors a small defiance against the muted tones of the prairie. She even scrubbed the soot stains from the hearthstones, a task Jed had never bothered with. He noticed these small changes, these acts of making, and though he rarely commented, his gaze would soften when he looked at her. The long silences between them remained, but they were no longer empty. They were filled with an unspoken understanding, a comfortable companionship. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Eliza spoke of her mother, of the small cottage garden they had once tended together, a lifetime ago. Jed listened, his usual stoicism gentled by the fading light. He didn't offer stories of his own past in return, not yet, but the act of listening, truly listening, was a gift. The future remained uncertain. The ranch was still a hard master, the elements a constant threat. There were no guarantees of comfort or ease. But as Eliza looked at Jed's profile outlined against the twilight sky, a quiet strength emanating from him, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. They had faced hardship, and would face more, but they would face it together. The seeds they had planted in the earth were a tangible symbol of their tentative hope, a shared investment in a future they were building, side by side, in the vast, indifferent landscape that had, against all odds, become their refuge and their home. He still hadn't asked her about the circumstances that led her to become a mail-order bride, and she hadn't volunteered the full, wretched tale. But the name he had married without knowing, Eliza, was now a name intrinsically linked to his own survival, and perhaps, to something more profound, something that might, with time and tending, blossom like the unexpected wildflowers by their door.